Good evening and welcome to Legacy After the Locker Room. I'm your host, Kayla Bradham, here tonight with NFL alumni, Norris Thomas. Norris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kayla. And this is an honor. This is pretty awesome. Thanks so much for having me. And hey, everybody, how y'all doing?
You know, Norris, we've got one thing in common. We have more than one thing in common, but let's just start with location, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Hey,
Hey, Bruce City, Middletown.
Bruce City. And our Bucks don't look like they're going to make it past. It's looking rough.
Uh,
Um,
I tease my cousin that lives in Milwaukee. And Giannis is on his way to the Lakers.
he might be. Norris, I know you love sports. You have quite a track record, no pun intended. Tell us a little bit about your sports journey as a youth and growing up in Milwaukee. What did sports mean to you and how did they impact you?
Well, the first thing is I moved to Milwaukee when I was in eighth grade. So I'm originally from Dothan, Alabama. So my first real foray into sports was I ran track for my Cub Scouts for a Cub Scout pack 63. And then that next summer is when I first played football in Dothan, Alabama. I played for a team called the Superfoods Redskins. And so that whole thing. So, growing up in the South, growing up in Alabama, this was 1977. You played football or you were in the band. That was kind of the thing. And at the time, Alabama Crimson Tide was coming off of, I think they had just won a championship and they were about to win another one. So back-to-back years, their quarterback, Stedman Shealy, was from Dothan. And so if you can imagine how that went. So you played football growing up in the South. So that's kind of where it all started, running behind my cousins and doing that kind of stuff. And then, of course, getting into, playing football that first year when I was in third grade. I watched kids and when I was in second grade that played and they'd come to school in their jerseys and I just would sit and I just daydream. I'd be sitting there like, wow, look at those uniforms. I just had to have one of those uniforms the next year. So, that's really where it started. I think, a couple of years even before that, I saw what a cleat did where you could run and not slide on the ground. So I just thought that was just the most amazing piece of technology that ever happened, that wait a minute, you can run and not slide because you got these things on there. So as crazy as it sounds, that's kind of what spurred my interest towards, football and being in sport. And that's what you did growing up. That's what you did growing up. That's what you did in the South.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the story of many of our podcast guests, regular kids playing in the neighborhood. You were obviously pretty good.
Well, I wasn't, that came later. I was around, everybody can tell you a story. We used to sit around in a locker room where there was always some kids that were absolute legends in our neighborhood. I wasn't one of them. And this is the truth. I think I was a hard worker and I knew that if I kept working hard and so on and so forth and just do what the coaches told you to do, that you'd have success. And so when I look back, in the beginning, here's a true story. So my first football game that I ever played in, I didn't even have my pads in right. Like my knee pads were underneath my thigh pads, and I didn't play much. I was a minimal play guy. I played right end on the offensive line, didn't get a lot to play, didn't play defense, and then I spent most of the game on the bench. So, but I will share this story with you. So my first game ever that we played in, we're about to lose a game. We're on the goal line, and the ball snaps. I'm not in the game, mind you. The ball snaps, and there's this large growl. Everybody growls and comes off the ball, and I hear this loud crash, and I fell in love with the game. It wasn't, it was that night. And so that first night after my first game where I didn't play a lot, I remember coming home, I'm still clean, still have my shoulder pads on, my pads, whatever, and I sat up on the countertop and I told my mom, I'm going to play in the national football. I'm going to play in the NFL, Mom. And I'm sure she just, yes. Of course she was very encouraging, but I was serious. Like I was sold because of I fell in love with the contact and the crash of those pads and the rest. We can talk about that later.
I love it. So you made your way to UW La Crosse.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about that story. Why did you choose La Crosse and what did it do for you?
Well, I mean, I think the part of that is, kind of part of my story. My freshman year of high school didn't go so great. I went to Milwaukee Tech, and we were just, in my book and on stage, we talk about overcoming homelessness. So I was in eighth grade when we moved to Milwaukee. So it took us about a year or so to really get on our feet. So by time spring rolled around of my freshman year, we finally were kind of getting settled. It moved a few times, ended up on the south side of Milwaukee, which was very rare back then, being a black family. So we were on 23rd and Greenfield. And so that my freshman year didn't go so well. So basically how I ended up at La Crosse, and this is true, I had to make up almost for my freshman year all the way through high school. Okay, so from a standpoint of Prop 48, I could have gone to Michigan and run track, but they wasn't going to let me play football. So I had a coach, one of my track coaches at South Division, and we were a very good track team. He went to UW La Crosse, and so he came back one day, my sophomore year of high school. UW La Crosse had won the national championship earlier that year in '85, and he had national champions across his hat. Well, guess what that and at the time, I'm just telling you, we're talking 1985, the Packers were horrible. The Badgers were not really good. But it resonated me because national champions sounded like Alabama. They had the colors like Alabama. So I basically said that day, if I don't get a scholarship to go play football anywhere else, that's where I'm going, sight unseen. So that's how I ended up at UW La Crosse, was I had a coach that actually went to UW La Crosse. He had that hat, and I just was bound and determined. I'm like, well, if nothing else happens, this is where I'm going. And so that's how I ended up at La Crosse. It was a Division III school. They did, Coach Roger Herring, he embraced me. He taught us and treated us like men. He always said to us, like, you have a better chance of becoming a brain surgeon than becoming a professional football player. And, I'd always joke with him, but Coach, I don't like science. So that's kind of how, that's how I managed getting around him, trying to push me somewhere else and so on. But the big reason why I chose football, or I never knew my dad. Okay, so what really drove me to want to play in the National Football League, or anything that would bring notoriety to me, I didn't know my father. So I had this crazy idea when I was, before I ever strapped on the pads. I thought, man, what if I got on national TV in the NFL and I could call out to my dad? So, did I love the game? Absolutely. But what was the real driving force? It wasn't necessarily the National Football League as much as it was, I wanted to find my dad. I thought this was going to be the only way. There's no internet. There's no YouTube. There's none of that stuff in 1977, 1978 or whatever. And so from there, that's kind of how I looked at, here's how I'm going to find my dad. And I always, one of the other things during that time frame, I've always been one of those guys that's been on the microphone. I started reading scriptures at my church when I was like 6 years old. So I've never had a fear of public speaking. So like this was easy. I could close my eyes and do this whole thing. But so it was going to be either I'm going to become this TV star and find my dad that way, or make it to the National Football League. So I tried out for a show in Dothan, Alabama. This major TV show came to town. It was called Palmerstown, USA. Had I got the part, I would have starred opposite Michael J. Fox on this show when I was like, basically about in sixth grade, somewhere in that age range. Well, I was a semifinalist to get, to make it out of that region. I didn't get the part. And I remember sitting in the car bawling, because in the back of my head, I thought, wow, well, this would take the place of playing football to find my dad. If I could get on the show, then great. I didn't get the part. And I remember sitting in the car and it was raining, and I felt like I let everybody down, especially myself. And so I'm bawling and I'm like, well, and at that moment, I totally put TV to the side. I'm like, we're just going to go play football. And that's how I'm going to find my dad. So that was the driving piece. So it didn't matter where I was going to, where I ended up in college and stuff like that. That was my driving force. A lot of people never knew that, not even really my mom, why I was, doing what I was doing. So, but UW Lacrosse, for me, it gave me a chance. It's beautiful there, number one. They really call it God's country, and it is. And it gave me a chance to develop as a young man. It gave me a chance to develop as a player. I had my failures there. I got beat for the game-winning touchdown my sophomore year in the national championship game. So we lost what would have been another title. I ended up having bad grades. I struggled my sophomore year. I went home to Milwaukee for a year and worked at Tate's ShopRite on 27th and National. I was the stock clerk manager 3 nights a week, and I had a crew that came in 2 nights a week. So, of course, working third shift, that's not what I wanted to do. So I returned back to UW Lacrosse. And, that second half of my career, even I'm on the Wall of Fame at UW Lacrosse. And if you look at my time there, it says 87 to 88 and 91 to 92. And so there's a comma there. And so, if that comma doesn't happen on the other side of that, none of this right now happens. There's no Speaker Norris Thomas or anything like that. So, to make a long story short, I go back and I'm an A student now. I'm doing everything that I need to do in the classroom. I'm back on the football team. My senior year, we ended up winning the national championship. I made every All-American list you could make, and I got my chance. I got my free, I was signed with the New York Giants after my senior year. And, when I ran track at UW Lacrosse after, people forget South Division where I went to high school, we won 5 state championships in a row when I was there, and I was on 3 of them. And so my last semester that I could possibly run track at Lacrosse, I ran indoors in the hurdles. And so my last year, UW Lacrosse, with everything that it had to offer, not just athletically but academically, I took advantage of all of those things, and I became an All-American. I graduated 2-sport All-American, 2-sport national champion, and everything, the whole dream came true for me.
And I appreciate you sharing that. And I know our listeners are wondering, but Norris, did you ever find your dad? And we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we do, I want to remind our listeners, whether they're watching the live stream or catching the podcast, this is Legacy After the Locker Room. We're powered by the Sports Philanthropy Network. I'm your host, Kayla Bradham, here today with NFL alumni Norris Thomas. So, Norris, I find it amazing, and I can relate to it growing up in a single-parent home raised by my mom. I was the same way in high school. I was, the president of every club, captain of cheerleading. I kept thinking if I could just get my name in the newspaper. Again, I graduated high school in 1991. No social media, no whatever, but I thought if I was good enough, pretty enough, popular enough, smart enough, that maybe my dad would want me. Maybe he'd want to know who I was. Maybe he'd want to see me because I had never met him. So what you're saying resonates with me, and I think it resonates with a lot of kids who are growing up in homes without their fathers. And somewhere along the way, fatherhood became your passion project.
Absolutely. The thing, I had, along the way, I had a lot of great coaches, okay? Some Hall of Fame, my high school track coach, John Vaughn, Hall of Fame, national coach, in the Coaches Hall of Fame. My track coach at UW Lacrosse is in NCAA Hall of Fame. And of course, Roger Herring is in the Hall of Fame, NCAA Hall of Fame, Coaches Hall of Fame. These were great motivators of people. They were great developers of young men. And so for me, I clamor to that. I always look to that for some type of leadership. Did I let them down at times? Absolutely. That's part of growing up and going through your growing pains. I had a lot of great mentors coming through and so on. But at the same time, there's still that in the back of your head. And growing up, I had a couple of stepdads along the way, but it's nothing like daddy. You know what I'm saying? And one guy in particular, Bobby, my brother's dad, he's a good man, but he wasn't my dad. And so it's, you loved him, but it's like, okay, there's still this whatever, that piece of it. And then, you have your mom who's raising you, and that there's things about yourself that, that's like her. But there's this other part of you that you don't know for sure who you really are. I mean, like the man side as you're coming into this. And those are questions that she can't answer. You're trying to figure that stuff out for yourself, and so on and so forth. So, but at the same time, the unique thing that happened for me, when I stopped playing football, I got into coaching. And they always say you typically become the people that are your most influential in your life. Well, the most influential persons in my life at the time were coaches. And so I got into coaching. And my first year, that I got into high school coaching, I already had a daughter. I had Brittany, my oldest daughter, and she might have been 3, if that. Yeah, she was little. And, I'm just loving on her and pouring into her. But then I get into coaching, and then all of a sudden, these young men are just like, they're on you. Like, and you're all of a sudden, you become this guy that you never thought you would become. And now all of a sudden, you're sitting 20, 30 minutes after practice, just sitting on the grass, sitting on a pad, talking to this kid, talking to him through, and you're starting to learn stuff. And, I was very fortunate when I first started doing coaching. God he sent me guys that didn't have dads. And, and I'm just being real with you, some of these kids, their dad, some of them have been in jail. So, I found out one of these kids was going home. I never understood why this kid was always so angry. Well, the head coach says, well, yeah, he goes home that night and he has to fist fight his dad. And then there were other kids that God was sending to me through church that had lost their fathers. And now all of a sudden, I'm kind of that guy. I'm filling in the gap. And I'm like trying to push back on the brakes. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, wait a minute, God. Like, what about me? Like, they don't have a father and I'm stepping in, but what about me? When does this happen? And so I'll quick share this. So one of the guys that I mentored while he was in high school, and this is a great kid, his name is Michael Lehan. Michael, I think now is like a superintendent of Osseo schools up in Minnesota. Well, Mike grew up in foster care. And at Hopkins, I was coaching at Hopkins High School in Minnesota. And Mike was about to be taken from his foster family. And he never knew his family and his parents, his biological parents. And one day he came to me and said, Coach, you're going to take me from the Nordstroms. And I said, Mike, are you a praying man? And he says, yeah. And I said, well, just pray. So everything worked out for him. And then Mike ended up getting a scholarship to play defensive back at University of Minnesota. While he's at University of Minnesota, I forget how it all worked out, he eventually found his biological parents. He lived in Texas. And now I'm really like thinking, okay, God, this isn't fair. Like, look at this happening for him. Why isn't this happening for me, type of thing? And not begrudgingly, just, one of those things of, wow. So I just felt like the more that I kept pouring into some of these young men that didn't have fathers, that the luck would change for me somewhere along the lines.
And did it?
Well, I always tease people, you have to get the book. Well, let's just say this. One of the things, I knew my football career was over. And this is a part that, when I was in the NFL and even in the CFL as a pro, the conversation came up all the time about who your dad was. And a lot of guys would buck up, they buck up, man, forget that dude, man. I don't need him. I got this far without him, this and that. And in the back of my head, I kind of was that. I got in a habit of liking to say, well, I never knew my father. I never knew my biological father. That was my tagline, basically. But kind of that was my machismo. Kind of like, okay, I'm here. It's not to say I don't need him, because I knew that if that dude walked through the door, I'd cry like a baby. So through time, I would ask my mom questions about who my dad was, and she never said no or whatever. I knew who he was. I knew what town he was from and so on. And but when my football career was over, and I knew it was over, it was hard to let go. And I wanted to let go. But a lot of athletes, any former athletes that's out there, a lot of times when it's time to retire and you're making that transition and you might want another shot. We all might want another shot. We all think we got something. And I had it in me to stick around. But it's hard to let that go. Well, one day I realized that I know why it was hard for me to let go. It was because I had so ingrained in my mind that this was the only way that I was going to find my dad. So if I let my NFL dream go, that's just like letting my dad go. That's almost just like a feather, let that float off into the. And I remember when it hit me like a ton of bricks. And the reason why it hit me like a ton of bricks is because God spoke to me. He's like, Norris, what did you ask me to do? And I said, well, I asked you, I just wanted to taste the NFL. All right, dude, well, I'll let you taste it. All right. You signed a contract. You played in preseason. You were in a training camp. I let you taste the NFL. But what was the promise, the deal that you made with me? I said, if you let me taste it, I'll serve you the rest of my life. And so, like, for me, rent was due. Rent was due. And, I'd even, when I was in the homeless shelter back in Milwaukee, I even said then, if I could just make it out of this situation, I would spend the rest of my life telling this story. So here we are. I'm now age 52. I was 13 then. So how many years ago is this? 39 years later. And I'm still living out this promise that I made to God that, hey, if you get me out of this, this is what I'll do. And if you get me out of this, and he tapped me on the shoulder. He said, dude, I gave you exactly what you had. You never asked me for fame or riches. You just says, let me taste it. But in the back of my head, I couldn't let it go because I thought, if I let this go, man, dude, the whole idea, the plan of finding my dad is out the window. This is like, what now, 1998, 99? No internet. I mean, it was kind of, but not like how we could do it now. So to get to the nitty gritty of your answering my question. So now this is now 2002. I'm obviously long retired from being an athlete professionally. And my last pro season was 95 with the Baltimore Stallions in the Canadian Football League. And I'm now living out here in Phoenix. And this is 2003. Yeah, it was 2003 at the time. And, I'm still looking for my father. I'm still, but I'm a dad. I had become a dad. At this time, Brittany's now 5, 6, 7 years old. I'm a dad, but I'm still looking for this guy. And so here's that crazy child logic. I decide, because I'm in Phoenix where the weather is perfect year round, basically, except for today, it's 108. I decided I was going to train for the Olympics. I was a hurdler in high school. I was an All-American hurdler in college. I probably could have gone that route if I could have lost some weight. Now at the time I'm, 195 pounds, 6% body fat. I'm the strongest I've ever been in my life, and I'm 31, 32 years old at the time. So I start training for the Olympics. I'm about a few thousands off the B qualifying standard to go to the, to be, at least get to the Olympic trials. At 32, still chasing this guy, still chasing this man in the back of my head. I still hadn't let it go. I mean, I have a t-shirt with the Olympic circles on it that I trained in through that whole time. And I found a guy that would coach me, that would help me out. And he says, I've coached Olympic hurdlers, and you're better than all of them. So I was still at 32. This is the whole thing about when we talk about the importance of fathers, what that can do, what it can do for you and stuff like that. It's extremely important. However, I get a phone call from a friend back in Minnesota. She called just to check and see how I was doing leaving Minnesota, and I'm huffing and puffing. This just so happened to have been the Thursday night before Father's Day 2003. So the Olympics is 2004. So had been training up until this point. I see that I had the little Motorola flip phone. I see it light up and say, "Oh, I'm out of breath because I'm at the track running late at night. What's going on? Hey, just wanted to see how everything was going, blah, blah, blah. It's great. Well, why are you out of breath?" Well, and here it is again. This is my story in my life. Well, I never knew my father, and I always wanted to find him if I could make it to national football. So I'm training for the Olympics. And he goes, "What? I thought you played football." Well, you see, no, really, I ran track in college, and I'm training, blah, 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 blah. And I just want to find him. She goes, "Well, where is he?" I says, "Well, I think he's in Reedsville, North Carolina." She says, "What's his name?" "Well, his name is Charlie Brown." And I could hear her writing stuff down. She says, "Okay, well, hold on. I'll call you back." She hangs up. I take a couple of more laps around the track. I see the phone light up in the corner. Here he is right here. What? So here's this situation where, I had spent my whole life, even when I was with the Giants, because I was conceived in Newark, New Jersey. So when I had an opportunity as a free agent, I could have went to a lot of different teams. Well, the Giants were going to draft me, I thought. So they brought me in, they flew me in, and I'm like, that's where I'm going. Go where you want it. So I went there. But I also thought on my off time, I could look for my dad. So remember the white pages? I would just sit in my room, paging through the white pages, looking for my dad, calling, literally cussed out a couple of times. Like, "What do you think you're doing? No, hang up." Boom. So, my roommate, Tico Duckett, went to Michigan State. He comes in one day, says, "Norris, what are you doing? Why is your hand shaking? Why are you sweating?" And here's my story again. Dude, I never knew my father. I wanted to get to the league so I could find my dad. And Tico's dad came out to visit us, one weekend. And I just took to him, like a dad. I was like, man, I wish my dad could have came and flew it out. Or maybe he's right here in Newark, New Jersey. I wouldn't know if he walked through the door. That was my thing. I would tell guys, we'd be driving down the street, even with I was with Michael Strahan. Michael Strahan was a rookie that year. I even told Michael Strahan one day, I'm like, dude, if my dad walked right in front of this car right now, I wouldn't know. I was so consumed with that. I don't think, it consumed me. It really, that was my whole everything. And I've even shared that with my son a couple of times. I'm like, look, I don't want you to do, I had a different reason. Find your own reason for driving you to what you want to do. So she calls me. I didn't have anything to write with. She says, "Here he is right here. He's on blah, blah, blah street. Here's his numbers. You got something to write with." So I go to this trash can, and it's at a school. There's a little nub of a pencil like this. And I chew off the edge just to get enough lead to write on this little piece of paper. And it was bad, but it was enough. I didn't sleep that night. I'm freaking out the whole night. Because my greatest two fears in my life were that my dad would die before I found him, or if I found him, that he would, reject me. So I tried to sleep that night. I get up the next morning, I call him. And I says, "Is this Charlie Brown?" He says, "Yes." I says, "Well," before I said anything, I'm like, "I don't want anything from you, man. Just blah, 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 blah." And then I went into my first sales pitch. I says, "Well, I graduated from college. I have a daughter. I'm married. I was All-American. I graduated from college, blah, 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 blah. For the low, low price of $19.99, you could have a son." You mind? Kind of that whole, I was pitching him, trying to sell myself that I'm worthy of him, whatever. And he could hear the pain in my voice. He could hear all of that. And so now I'm a father myself. And as we went through this conversation, and you could hear the pain, and you could hear me crying, and he told me that he loved me. And he could hear me crying. He says, "Weeping may endure for a night." And I said, and we both said this together, "but joy comes in the morning." And for the first time in my life, to hear my father say he loved me, as many times at that point that I had told my own daughter how much I loved her. Now obviously I have two other children, and it's wonderful. I'm a dad. One of the things that I found out about my father, in our first conversation, he asked me what it is that I did, and I says, "Well, I'm a motivational speaker." He says, "Oh, you're an evangelist." I says, "No, I'm a speaker." So he kind of broke it down. He says, "Actually, you're an evangelist." He says, "It's your job to turn over the tables and then give it back to the meeting planner and let them handle things." So my dad spoke into my life, into what it is that I do to this day that I had already been doing. It turns out my dad passed away 3 years ago in December of 2018. He had a stroke. So before we ever got to physically meet, he had a stroke. But I did get to see him, but never in his physical. We would talk on the phone for hours. What was supposed to be a 20-minute conversation would be 4 hours. And he would, just whatever. And so he helped shape me as a dad up until he had that stroke. And if he said he was going to call, he would call. He always kept his word. And those things resonated with me. But I didn't know this until I went to his funeral in Reedsville. My father had pastored a church. And so, when we talk about the importance of fathers, now, there's good in everybody. And I think that's if I had to say anything about my dad or who I am as a father, a lot of it comes from my mom, yeah, but my dad's DNA is still stamped in me. You can get the good stuff from that person. Here's a man that I never spent a earthly day with. So in my book, In His Image, Fatherless to Fatherhood, the Bible says we are created in God's image and in His likeness. Well, how is it that a man, and I never spent a earthly day with, other than once he was in basically almost like in a hospice situation after he had a stroke, but I'm just like him. His kids or my brothers that I got to meet and sisters that I have met, they said, "You're just like him. You're the spitting image of him." So how much more are we like Christ? So that's really where my book kind of pushes towards, is that, we're made in God's image, and we are supposed to take our place in our communities. Whether you're female or male, you're supposed to take your place in your community, in your household as father, but also beyond your four walls. And so that is that's the banner that I wave. Whether you want to call it fatherhood, if you want to call it leadership in your community, taking the role of leadership is a role of being like a father. You're leading. And, we're made, like I said, they say I shoot pool like my dad. My dad was a pool shark. I do everything just like him. And I never spent a day with him. Crazy, huh?
It's crazy. It's beautiful crazy. It's mixed up crazy. You're blessed.
Amen. Yeah.
You're blessed.
Absolutely.
And Norris, I know you've written a book about it. I did put up on the screen, but I want to make sure anybody who's listening to the podcast knows how they can get the book or how to reach out to you for speaking engagements. Simply go to www.norristhomas.com. Norris, tell them the name of that book one more time.
So the name of the book is called In His Image, Fatherless to Fatherhood. And the subtitle is Chasing My NFL Dream in Search of the Father I Never Knew to Become the Father I Always Wanted. And so it's pretty cool. I tell people this all the time. I wrote a book and I created my life's work. And we do corporate events and everything else. And I weave that story in and out. And, there's some great takeaways from the story. The book is even a lot more detail about being homeless and the whole thing. But at the end of it, it's really about, taking your place as a father or as a leader in your community and making our world so much better. It's really, like you said, it's really been as you go through this journey, to kind of how this all has worked out for me. I told my dad that the plan that I had, and he laughed at me, and I says, I had 2 shoulder surgeries, this and that. He says, it never would have happened that way. And I says, why? He says, I don't watch sports on TV. So the crazy things we do as kids or whatever, and it never even happened that way, but it happened. I mean, honestly, I'm very blessed, and to know, A, I have another set of siblings out there. B, I got to know my father, and and it's helped me to be a good father to my kids.
Well, I want to thank you for growing into the man that God created you to be. I want to give you a moment or two to thank the people that you need to thank and get your parting words of wisdom. But, Norris, before we do that, I ask every guest on Legacy After the Locker Room to partner with Sports Philanthropy Network and myself to make an autograph donation to Special Olympics. Norris, can we count on you for your support?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Awesome. Any idea what you might donate?
Well, we definitely got books. You can find, definitely, it could be a book. It could definitely be one of the books.
That would be awesome. I think there's a lot of kids out there and young adults who'd love to read your story.
And
Norris,
it's only 210 pages, so you're not gonna. This isn't a sleeper. It's enough. It keeps you moving, and right when you get there, it's over.
I think it's so great because I also teach high school English, and all my students have to do 4 book reports each year for me. I just got a new book report book.
Oh, you bet. Absolutely.
Norris, I want to give you a moment to thank the people in your life that you need to thank, and then I want to close with your words of wisdom, if you don't mind.
Well, first, we give glory to God, and even more so, my mom, Sandra, she gave me life, and took care of me. Never withheld information about my dad, which I think is very, very important. In the logistics of relationships, how they go. Never had a bad word to say about my dad, and fortunately, I was able to find him. My brothers, Mark and Jason, and of course, Mike. None of this happens without Coach Herring at UW Lacrosse, and a ton of coaches. Of course, John Bowen, we talked about him, and then I listened to a speaker years ago. He's passed away. His name is Miles Monroe. Miles Monroe kind of gave me the vision of how to how to share this message. But when I first heard him, there were still chapters that still hadn't been lived yet. So, for that piece of it, and most importantly, my kids. My oldest daughter, Brittany, and I have a grandson, a great son-in-law. His name is Ari. So the Quanjos, and my son and daughter Tatum and Braxton Tatum's. Brittany ended up with a scholarship at the University of Alabama for volleyball, and Tatum's going to Grand Canyon on the volleyball scholarship, and Braxton's just a freshman. But my kids are my rock. I honestly, they're more than they are more than my why. That's the truth.
I love it. Love it.
And I don't know if I had a word of wisdom, prepare. If this is for parents, say what you mean what you say. You're not in control. You're just here to manage. Say what you mean and mean what you say. You're not in control. You're just here to manage. And, my mom always said this too. If not the best, then one of the best. Not the best, then one of the best. That's all you can try and do. And most importantly, just master the human experience. Take what's coming at you and try to master it. Get to a place of mastery. We look forward to hearing from people down the road, reaching at my website, or shoot me an email, info@norristhomas.com.
Again, that's www.norristhomas.com. I'm your host, Kayla Bradham, here with today's guest, NFL alumni Norris Thomas, reminding you to live your legacy. Thanks, Norris.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. You guys be blessed.